She paid for her seat. She earned her place. But when a white passenger wanted it, the airline gave it to him. What happens when a powerful black CEO, dressed not for attention but for comfort, is told she doesn't belong in first class? When the crew removes her publicly, without cause, just to appease another traveler? What happens when the woman they tried to humiliate quietly makes a call, and 10 minutes later, the entire crew is fired? But this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about legacy, courage, and a voice that refused to stay silent. Who is Ava Clarke, and why did her quiet stand echo across the globe? What did she uncover behind the polished smiles of a billion-dollar airline? And how did one incident at 30,000 feet ignite a movement that changed the skies forever? Stay with us as we unfold a story of quiet resistance, sharp injustice, and a woman who turned a stolen seat into a new standard for the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now let's begin the story. Ava Clarke stood at Gate 12B, watching the sunrise stretch across the tarmac at JFK. Methought the glass glinted with gold, casting long shadows over the waiting passengers, most of them bleary-eyed business travelers in navy suits and noise-canceling headphones. She held her phone loosely in one hand, her boarding pass already pulled up on the screen. First class, seat 1A. She had flown this route 100 times. Still, the soft thrum of anticipation hummed beneath her calm exterior. Ava was used to attention. At 41, she was the founder and CEO of ArcLight Systems, a tech firm that started out of a shared workspace in Harlem and now secured digital infrastructure for Fortune 100 companies. Her face had graced the cover of Wired and Fast Company, and she'd recently been listed among the top 10 most influential women in tech. But none of that changed the fact that airport staff still often glanced at her just a beat too long, as if trying to connect her with someone else they expected. She adjusted the cuff of her cream-colored blazer and inhaled slowly. This wasn't just another flight. Seattle was waiting, and with it, the final pitch for a $300 million merger that would redefine ArcLight's future. She had spent months preparing the presentation, rehearsing every slide until her voice carried the perfect mix of clarity and control. And yet what kept circling in her mind was something softer, quieter. Her mother. She had died 6 months earlier, quietly, in her sleep. It wasn't tragic. It was time. But the loss still felt like a sudden winner. Her mother had been her first mentor, her first believer, the woman who told her that strength doesn't mean loudness. It means knowing when to speak and when to listen. Remember who you are, she had said during Ava's last visit. Even when they try to forget. Group 1 were ready to begin boarding for Flight 708 to Seattle, the gate agent called, snapping Ava from her thoughts. She stepped forward and smiled gently at the woman behind the desk. "Good morning," Ava said, presenting her phone. The gate agent glanced at the name on the screen, her expression shifting into something overly professional, guarded even. "Ms. Clarke, first class. Yes. One moment." Ava raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. After a few awkward seconds, the woman nodded and gestured her through. "Enjoy your flight." The carpeted jet bridge muffled her steps. As she entered the plane, the lead flight attendant gave her a quick glance. "Welcome aboard," she said, but her voice was cool, not unfriendly, but not exactly warm either. Ava offered a polite smile and made her way to seat 1A, storing her carry-on neatly in the overhead bin before sitting down. The seat was plush and wide, outfitted with a quilted headrest and ample legroom. She pulled out her tablet and opened her final presentation draft. A soft classical track played through the cabin speakers. She always found this moment the quiet before takeoff strangely peaceful. A pause before the momentum. Minutes passed. Passengers trickled in, chatting in low voices, eyes glazed with fatigue. Most were white men in their 40s and 50s. A few gave her brief glances, not unkind, but distant, as if she were a deviation from their expected cabin landscape. She barely noticed. She had learned not to read too much into fleeting glances. A soft vibration on her wristwatch reminded her to breathe. She placed a hand on her lap and exhaled through her nose, grounding herself. Behind her, she heard the clinking of ice as drinks were prepared in the galley. She didn't look up when someone sat in 1C beside her. She was already deep in thought, rechecking a chart on her screen. But she did notice the slight change in the air, the way conversation behind her dipped, the way the attendant passed by again more slowly, the way eyes suddenly found her in the reflection of the glossy bulkhead panel. She shook it off. "You've got this," she whispered to herself. "Excuse me," came a voice from across the aisle. A white woman, somewhere in her 50s. Her blonde hair in a tight bun, leaned slightly forward. Her name tag read, Laura Hastings. "Could I just verify your seat?" Ma'am Ava looked up, surprised. "Yes, of course." She tilted her screen so the attendant could see. Seat 1A, clear as day. Laura gave a tight-lipped smile. "Just double-checking. Thank you." She disappeared again. Ava stared after her, her brows knitting slightly. It wasn't the first time someone had double-checked her seat. She thought of the conference in Boston last year, when she was asked to leave the executive lounge until someone recognized her from Forbes. She returned to her screen, but her mind had shifted. There was a familiar flicker in her chest, a whisper she had learned to suppress. "Be ready." The pilot's voice came over the speaker, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Roger Holt. We're finalizing boarding for Flight 708 to Seattle. Weather looks good for our route today." Ava barely heard the rest. Her eyes had drifted toward the front again. Laura was in conversation with someone boarding late. A tall man in a crisp suit white, salt and pepper hair, expensive leather briefcase. He looked past Laura and locked eyes with Ava. Then his jaw tightened, and Ava knew. She had seen that look before. She looked back at her screen, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. But not yet. Not quite yet. Ava Clarke adjusted the volume on her earbuds and leaned back slightly as the cabin began to fill. Her favorite track piano and strings drifted softly, just enough to ease the tension in her shoulders. She had always found music to be a tether in high-pressure moments. It reminded her to breathe, to stay grounded, to stay still. She caught the eye of a young flight attendant offering water to incoming passengers. He nodded politely. A small kindness? She appreciated it more than she let on. Seat 1C remained empty beside her. That was typical. VIP seats often remained reserved until the last minute. Ava didn't mind. The extra space meant fewer questions, fewer side glances, fewer little moments that chipped away at her focus. Still, something felt off. She looked up briefly. Laura Hastings, the same attendant who had questioned her seat earlier, was walking slowly down the aisle with a tablet in hand. Her brows were furrowed, lips pursed. She looked up, saw Ava watching her, and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Ava turned her gaze back to her screen, pretending to scroll through her slides. But she could still feel the weight of Laura's presence, a heaviness that hung just a little too long. Then, a voice broke the rhythm. "You've got to be kidding me." It was low, frustrated, unmistakably directed at her. Ava looked up and saw him, the same man from earlier, salt and pepper hair, pinstripe suit. He was holding a boarding pass in his hand and gesturing toward Ava's seat. Greg Matheson. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew the type. His presence filled the space like a thundercloud. He wasn't yelling, not yet, but his voice carried the kind of entitlement that didn't need volume to cause a scene. Laura stepped between them, her hand up as if calming an agitated customer. Mr. Matheson, let me just double-check something in the system. Greg didn't move. His eyes locked on Ava like she was a problem to be solved. That's my seat, he said, louder this time. Ava remained seated, her tone calm but firm. I believe there's been a mix-up. I've been assigned 1A. It's on my boarding pass. Greg leaned in, flashing his ticket like a badge of authority. This is 1A, he snapped. That's what it says right here. I request this seat every time. Every time, Laura chimed in, a little too quickly. I'm sure this is just a system issue. We'll get it cleared up. Ava turned her tablet off and folded her hands in her lap. I've had this seat reserved for 6 weeks, she said softly. And I checked in early this morning. Laura gave her a tight smile, then looked back at Greg. Mr. Matheson, why don't you step aside for a moment while I confirm? No, he barked. Why don't she step aside? I'm not moving. Several passengers turned their heads now. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away, pretending not to listen. Ava sat very still. This wasn't new. She had been mistaken for an assistant. She had been ignored in meetings until a man repeated her point. She had been followed by security in upscale stores, where her own company's products were sold. But this felt different. This felt planned. The same patterns in a new costume. Laura returned with another tablet, this time with her supervisor trailing behind. A middle-aged man with a tight haircut and a clipboard, his name tag reading Frank Reynolds. What seems to be the issue here? He asked Greg, not Ava. She's in my seat. Greg answered flatly. And I'm not flying coach because of a mix-up. Ava didn't flinch. Her voice remained steady. This is my seat, sir. Confirmed via email and boarding pass. I'm happy to show you. Frank looked mildly annoyed, but nodded. Ma'am, do you mind letting me take a look? Ava handed him the boarding pass. He stared at it for several seconds, then scrolled through the airline tablet with Laura. You see it? Laura asked in a low voice. 2 entries for 1A. That's a glitch, Frank said under his breath. Again? Which one booked first? She asked. Frank hesitated. Technically, hers. Laura's eyes narrowed. Technically. She confirmed 3 days before he did. But he's Platinum Plus. Longtime donor. Personal friend of Becker. Becker. The airline's CEO. Laura pressed her lips together. She didn't like what she was hearing, but she also knew what was expected. Frank turned to Ava with a rehearsed expression of professionalism. Ms. Clarke, there seems to be a rare technical overlap in the booking system. Ava gave a single nod. I see. We'd like to offer you a seat in our Business Plus section. Frank continued. Very comfortable. Complimentary beverages and Wi-Fi. And of course, we'll refund the seat difference. Ava tilted her head slightly. To clarify, you're asking me to vacate the seat I reserved, paid for, and was seated in first, because someone with more status wants it. Frank shifted. No one's asking anyone to give up anything. We're just hoping to find the easiest solution so we can depart on time. Ava exhaled slowly. The easiest solution. Always the same phrase. Translation. Don't make this hard. Don't be the problem. She glanced at Greg. He was smirking now, loosening his tie. He thought this was over. "I'll stay here," Ava said. Her voice was even, but something in her tone made Laura blink. "I'm sorry," Frank asked, confused. "I'll stay in my assigned seat," Ava repeated. "I'm not causing a scene. I'm simply occupying the space I legally reserved." Greg scoffed. "You people and your drama." There it was. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Everyone heard it. No one said anything. Laura turned away. Frank's jaw clenched, but neither reprimanded him. Ava's fingers tightened on the armrest. Her throat was dry, but her voice didn't waver. "Would you like me to call my assistant?" she asked quietly. "She's at the gate. She has all the receipts." Laura held up a hand, unsure now. Frank looked between them. The tension was no longer quiet. It had weight. Passengers were watching, some with phones angled subtly. Ava noticed. She hoped they were filming, because what was happening here was not new. But maybe, if it was seen clearly, it could be understood. Frank cleared his throat. "Captain Holt will be with you shortly," he said, and turned to walk away. Laura lingered for a moment. Ava looked up at her. "Was it worth it?" she asked gently. "Giving him the benefit of the doubt. And not me." Laura didn't answer. She didn't have to. She walked away, and Ava sat in 1A, still, strong, waiting. The first-class cabin had gone quiet. Not silent, but heavy in that familiar, uncomfortable way that settles when tension moves through a room, but no one wants to name it. Some passengers had buried their faces in newspapers or opened their laptops with exaggerated focus. Others glanced sideways without turning their heads, stealing furtive looks like teenagers watching a substitute teacher unravel. Ava remained seated, hands gently folded in her lap. Her tablet sat untouched on the tray table, its screen dark now. She stared ahead, her posture perfect, her breath slow and measured. On the surface, she was composed, but beneath that calm, a storm brewed, quiet and sharp. She had seen it all before, at a restaurant in London. The waiter had asked if she was meeting someone before handing her a menu. At a corporate retreat, a junior developer had assumed she was part of the catering staff. At a board meeting in San Diego, an investor once suggested she take notes, assuming she was an assistant despite her name being the first on the agenda. Always the assumption, always the pause before respect, and always the pressure to smile through it, to swallow offense like it was the price of success. Be gracious. Be professional. Don't feed the stereotype. Don't give them a reason to doubt you. She could feel that familiar weight pressing against her chest now. From the corner of her eye, she saw Laura whispering with a younger flight attendant near the galley. Neither looked her way, but their glances spoke volumes. Across the aisle, Greg Matheson leaned back in seat 1C, now occupied, apparently, by a man in his mid-30s wearing a tech startup hoodie and holding a tablet. The two men didn't speak, but Greg shifted occasionally, checking his phone, his lips curled in a faint smirk. Ava tried not to look at him. Frank Reynolds returned minutes later, this time with a more forced smile, the kind that comes when someone is following orders they don't agree with. "Ms. Clarke," he said, crouching slightly so his voice wouldn't carry. "Captain Holt would like to speak with you before departure." "Would you mind stepping into the galley for a moment?" Ava turned to face him fully. "I'd prefer to stay seated. If the captain wants to speak to me, he's welcome to do so here." Frank hesitated. "He's preparing the cabin, but I understand. I'll let him know." She nodded once and watched him walk away. The younger flight attendant, his name tag said Cameron, shot her a brief look. a flash of something like sympathy. It disappeared the moment Laura caught him looking. Ava returned her gaze to the window. Rain had started to tap lightly against the glass. The sky had grayed over. It looked like a scene from every departure she'd ever watched. But today it felt metaphorical. The brewing storm wasn't outside. It was 30,000 feet below, in every policy, every silent look, every system designed to protect one and politely erase the other. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. It was a gift from her mother, a thin gold band etched with the words, "You belong here." She used to repeat that phrase to Ava every time she faced rejection. "You belong here." The cockpit door opened. Captain Roger Holt emerged, tall, late 50s, wearing the standard Navy uniform and a clean-cut authority that had probably never been questioned in his life. He didn't smile. "Ms. Clarke," he said curtly, stepping into the aisle. Ava looked up, but didn't stand. "Yes, Captain." He glanced at Frank, who stood just behind him. "I understand there's been a seating confusion." "There has," Ava said calmly, "but it's not confusion on my part. I booked this seat, checked in early, and was seated before Mr. Matheson even boarded." The captain nodded. "Stone-faced. Our system indicates 2 bookings were processed for 1A, an unfortunate glitch." Ava leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but resolute. "And I understand from your staff that I booked first." "That's not the issue," Captain Holt replied quickly. "The issue is that this situation is delaying our flight, and I need all passengers to comply with the crew's resolution so we can depart on time." "Comply," she repeated, testing the word on her tongue. "Yes, ma'am. And what resolution would that be?" "Exactly." He straightened his back. "That you relocate to Business Plus so we can keep this flight on schedule." Ava met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not moving." The captain's jaw tensed. "I'd rather not escalate this further." "Then don't," she said. Behind them, Greg cleared his throat loudly, feigning exasperation. "Are we seriously still doing this? I have a connection to Tokyo. I don't have time for this drama." Ava didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Holt. "You're asking me to move from a seat I booked, paid for, and boarded early because another passenger doesn't want to sit elsewhere. I'm asking you to help us resolve this smoothly," Holt corrected, but his voice was tightening. "Why aren't you asking him?" she asked quietly. He paused. "I'm giving you an option, ma'am." "No," she said. "You're giving me an ultimatum." She turned to Frank. "Is there any written policy that allows you to remove a seated, paid passenger from first class for the convenience of another, without cause?" Frank opened his mouth, closed it again. "I don't have that information in front of me," he muttered. Ava nodded. "I thought so." Captain Holt's face had gone from neutral to annoyed. If you don't comply, I'll be forced to remove you from this flight." Ava looked around the cabin. People were watching now. Phones were out. The man in 2B had tilted his device just enough to record discreetly. A woman in 3A was staring straight ahead, lips pressed together, refusing to see. She looked back at the captain. "Then go ahead," she said. He blinked. "Excuse me." "Go ahead." Ava repeated. "Remove me. Let every phone in this cabin record it. Let the press release your justification. Let the story be that a black woman CEO was removed from a flight she paid for because a white man felt more entitled to her seat." Captain Holt's nostrils flared. Frank looked panicked now. Greg laughed. "Jesus, now it's about race." "No," Ava said softly, still looking at Holt. It's always been about power." Silence stretched out. Then the captain turned without another word and walked back to the cockpit. Frank followed like a shadow. Laura approached Ava again, her voice a little more strained this time. "Ma'am, please, this isn't worth it." Ava tilted her head. Not worth what Laura's mouth opened, then closed. Ava picked up her tablet and turned it on. She didn't speak again, and Laura walked away. Captain Holt had retreated behind the cockpit door, but the energy in the cabin hadn't reset. It hung there, invisible but electric, like static clinging to everything. The seats, the walls, the air itself felt different. Passengers glanced at each other, then away. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to be the next one singled out. Ava Clarke returned to her tablet, her fingers gently swiping through the presentation she had memorized weeks ago. The numbers, the charts, the projections, they all looked the same. But she couldn't focus. She wasn't reading anymore. Her mind was moving elsewhere. She thought of the first time she was told to sit in the back. Not on a plane, but at a dinner for an angel investor event in Palo Alto. They had her name on the guest list, but not on the seating chart. Every founder got a spot up front except her. When she spoke to the coordinator, they apologized and pointed to the table near the servers. That night, she stood the entire meal and closed $2.5 million in funding. But still, it stung. Now, she was back in another kind of front seat. And again, they were trying to move her. She glanced at her watch. They were officially delayed. She imagined the people in coach checking their layover schedules, irritated but silent, unaware of what was happening just a few feet away. Frank Reynolds returned once more, his expression increasingly weary. The tension on his face was visible now, no longer concealed by corporate politeness. "Ms. Clarke," he began, keeping his voice low. "I don't think the captain is going to change his mind." Ava looked up from her screen. "So this is final." "I'm afraid so. If you don't move to Business Plus voluntarily, you will be escorted off the aircraft." Ava didn't respond right away. Her eyes met his. There was no anger in her expression, only a kind of quiet exhaustion, like someone tired of being forced to explain the obvious. "Then you'll have to escort me," she said, "because I'm not moving." Frank hesitated, swallowing hard. "I understand how this looks. I really do." "No," Ava said softly. "You don't." Frank opened his mouth, but there was nothing else to say. He gave a short nod and turned toward the front of the plane. Greg Matheson was already watching. He chuckled, arms crossed, bouncing his knee as though he were settling in for a movie he'd seen too many times. "You know," he said loudly, "I've flown this route for years. Never seen a situation like this. Unbelievable. Some people just can't take a hint." Ava didn't turn to look at him, but the man in 2B, the one holding his phone discreetly earlier, shifted in his seat and shot Greg a quick look of disgust. He didn't say anything, but the change in body language was clear, a tiny rebellion. Frank returned a moment later, this time flanked by two uniformed airport security officers. They weren't aggressive, not yet. Their faces were blank, their body language neutral. But the sight of them was enough to turn every head in the cabin. Gasps, a few murmurs. A woman behind Ava clutched her handbag tighter. A man 2 rows up began filming openly now. Phone held at chest level, red recording light blinking. "Ma'am," one of the officers said gently, "we need you to come with us." Ava remained seated. "I'd like to speak with legal representation before being removed." "You can make calls once we're off the aircraft," the officer replied. "I'm not being disruptive," Ava said calmly. I'm sitting quietly in the seat I purchased. The officer nodded, but didn't move. He was waiting. Passengers whispered. Greg scoffed again. She's making it harder than it needs to be. That comment got louder reactions. A few people actually winced. Then came the voice. Enough. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it sliced through the cabin like a gust of wind. Ava turned to see a woman standing in row 3B. She looked to be in her 70s, with short silver hair and sharp eyes. Her travel clothes were simple but elegant. A cream sweater, slacks, a soft blue scarf. She leaned slightly on a cane, but stood tall all the same. I've been watching this unfold for the past 20 minutes, the woman said, her voice unwavering. And it's clear to me that this isn't about protocol. It's about prejudice. Frank looked startled. Ma'am, please return to your seat. I will not, she said. She stepped forward carefully, her cane tapping the floor like punctuation. This woman has done nothing wrong. She's being removed because someone with power decided they didn't want to be inconvenienced. A hush spread through the cabin. The officers looked at each other. Frank looked helpless. Laura Hastings stepped in then, trying to de-escalate. Mrs. Reverend Annabelle Lee, the woman answered, never breaking eye contact with Frank. Retired. Former civil rights pastor. I've seen a lot in my day. This is not new. One of the officers cleared his throat. We're just following orders. Ma'am, and sometimes, Reverend Lee replied, orders are wrong. Greg finally stood up. This is ridiculous. Can we get on with it already? I've got a meeting in Tokyo, and we're all just sitting around waiting on this scene to end. Reverend Lee turned to him calmly. You've made your point clear. You value your time more than another person's dignity. Greg sneered. Don't get self-righteous on me, lady. She didn't flinch. Ava rose from her seat. Her voice was low, almost too soft to hear. Don't. Reverend Lee turned to her, surprised. Ava looked at the officers, then at Frank. I'm not leaving because of what he said. I'm leaving because I don't want to give this airline the pleasure of forcing me. Her gaze moved to the rows of passengers watching her like a movie they couldn't pause. But I want everyone to understand, she continued. This isn't about a seat. It never was. It's about who you think belongs here and who you don't. That's the story, and I won't let it end here. She picked up her bag. Security flanked her, but not aggressively. There was no need. She walked slowly toward the front of the cabin, Reverend Lee beside her. No one spoke, no one clapped, but several phones were still recording. As Ava stepped into the jet bridge, she heard Greg settle into 1A. Finally, he muttered. Behind her, someone said quietly. She'll own this plane by next week. Ava didn't smile, but she heard it, and she didn't forget. The corridor of the jet bridge was colder than Ava expected. The air conditioning blasted through the narrow tunnel like a wind tunnel, humming loud and indifferent. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, each step a quiet echo of everything she was trying to hold in. She didn't speak. Not to the security officers flanking her, not to Reverend Lee, who had followed a few paces behind. She didn't even glance back toward the cabin. She wouldn't give Greg Matheson the satisfaction of knowing she'd looked over her shoulder. At the end of the bridge stood two airline supervisors, both middle-aged men in matching Navy suits. One held a tablet, the other a radio. Their posture was stiff, professional. Their faces were unreadable. "Ma'am," one of them said, stepping forward as Ava approached. I'm Brian Mills, Corporate Liaison for New Heights Air. We'd like to sort this out quickly and with minimal disruption. Minimal disruption. That phrase struck her like a slap across the face. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't respond right away. She dropped her carry-on next to her feet, placed her tablet gently on top of it, then turned to face the men fully. Minimal disruption, she repeated softly. Is that what you call what just happened back there? Brian's face twitched. He wasn't expecting resistance. Not here, not now. I understand this has been upsetting. Do you, she interrupted, her voice steady, do you understand what it means to be escorted off a plane by two officers in front of a cabin full of passengers, cameras recording, all because someone else didn't want me in the seat I paid for silence? Behind her, Reverend Lee leaned against the wall, her cane resting at her side. She wasn't speaking now. She didn't need to. Ava shook her head and looked down at her ruined blouse. A brown coffee stain had bloomed across the fabric when one of the officers had accidentally bumped her as she stood. It was cold now, sticky, and clinging to her skin. She'd barely noticed it in the moment. She looked at Brian again. I need to call my legal team, she said. He hesitated. We'd prefer to resolve this before it escalates. Too late, Reverend Lee said from the wall. Ava reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone. As she unlocked it, her notifications exploded. Dozens of pings lit the screen. Mentions, DMs, hashtags, some she recognized, some she didn't. She opened the camera folder and clicked on a video. There she was, standing calmly in her seat, Greg towering beside her, the security officers arriving, her walk toward the jet bridge. It was all captured. Filmed clearly by a passenger in 2B. It had already been uploaded. Already had over 200,000 views. A comment section flooded with words like typical, unacceptable, and racial profiling. She closed the video and opened her contacts. Maya, she said into the phone. A pause. A voice answered, tight with worry. I saw it. I'm outside. I'm coming to you now. No. Stay where you are, Ava said. Record everything. Call our PR lead. Then legal. I've already started, Maya replied. They've tagged you in 6 major posts. It's going viral. Everyone's talking about it. Ava exhaled through her nose. Good. Let them. She ended the call. Brian shifted awkwardly. Ms. Clarke, he said carefully. Perhaps you'd allow us to offer you a private lounge while we sort out compensation. A full refund. Of course. And miles credit. Business plus round trip on us. Ava looked at him like he was speaking a different language. You want to buy my silence with airline miles? That's not I don't want your lounge, she said. I want an answer. Why was I removed from my seat instead of the man who booked it after me? Brian glanced at his colleague, who stared down at the tablet as if hoping it would swallow him whole. We're reviewing the incident. No, she cut in. You've already made your decision. What you're reviewing now is damage control. He didn't deny it. Ava turned her eyes toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her blouse stained, hair slightly out of place, eyes sharp and tired all at once. She had faced boardroom takeovers, hostile media cycles, and condescending VCs. But this felt different. This felt personal. This was supposed to be a quiet flight, she said, half to herself. I wasn't here to cause trouble. I was headed to Seattle for a meeting that will shape the future of my company. I had everything prepared. I was ready. But none of that mattered. Because you didn't see a CEO. You saw someone who didn't belong. Brian opened his mouth again. but nothing came out. The silence stretched. Then footsteps sounded behind them. It was Cameron Wyatt, the younger flight attendant who had glanced at Ava with sympathy earlier. He looked nervous but determined. "Ms. Clarke," he said gently, "I just wanted to say, I saw everything, and I'm sorry." Brian turned sharply. "Cameron, you shouldn't be here. I'm on break," he said simply, "and I needed to say it." Ava's eyes met his. "Did you document what happened?" Cameron nodded. "I took notes, and I filmed part of it. Not just the removal. The conversation between Laura and Frank before. The way they talked about Mr. Matheson." Brian's eyes went wide. "That's a serious violation of policy." Cameron didn't blink. "So is discrimination." Reverend Lee pushed off the wall and stepped beside Ava. "You've got a witness, child," she said. "Don't let them shut you up." Ava nodded slowly. She looked back toward the terminal entrance. A small crowd had gathered just beyond the glass. People pointing toward her, phones held up, a buzz of movement. The public was already watching. She picked up her bag. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," she said, "and I'll be holding a press conference before I board any flight again." She turned to Brian one last time. "You had a choice today, and you made the wrong one." Then she walked out of the jet bridge, Reverend Lee and Cameron following quietly behind her. Behind them, the cabin door closed again. The plane began its final preparations for departure. And in seat 1A, Greg Matheson shifted comfortably in his seat, sipping a fresh glass of champagne, unaware that outside, the storm he thought he had silenced was only just beginning. The Uber ride from the terminal to Ava's hotel was only 12 minutes, but the silence inside that black SUV felt like hours. Ava sat in the back seat, hands clasped tightly around her phone, her mind racing. Her blouse was still damp from the coffee stain. Her throat ached from holding her voice level for so long. And yet, she hadn't cried. She couldn't. There wasn't time for that. Not when the world had already begun watching. Reverend Annabelle Lee sat beside her in the back, scrolling quietly through her own phone, eyes sharp behind her glasses. Cameron Wyatt sat in the passenger seat up front, nervously glancing at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked like a man torn between duty and conscience. And maybe that's exactly what he was. 23 million views, Reverend Lee muttered. Ava looked up. "Already? Since you stepped off that plane." Ava unlocked her phone again. The notifications were impossible to track now. She had been tagged in posts by national journalists, activists, celebrities she didn't even follow. Her name was trending. So was the airlines. Ava Clarke, Flight 708. Black excellence denied systemic bias. In the sky. She scrolled down and saw Cameron's video had been reposted by an aviation watchdog account. It showed Laura Hastings whispering to Frank Reynolds minutes before boarding. It caught the exact moment Laura's mouth said, "He's on Becker's VIP list. Just swap her out quietly." Frank's reply was muffled but clear enough. "She'll go quietly. They always do." Ava felt her stomach turn. "Do you still want to do the press conference?" Cameron asked, turning slightly in his seat. His voice was low, uncertain. "You don't have to. I mean, the video's doing the talking." Ava didn't answer right away. She looked out the window. The Seattle skyline shimmered in the distance, framed by dusk and a storm rolling in behind the hills. The whole city seemed to hold its breath. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering her thoughts. "They think this will blow over by morning," she finally said. "A social media blip, a news cycle flash. But if I go quiet now, it sends a message to every girl who looks like me. Stay silent. Sit down. Apologize for making noise. Reverend Lee nodded slowly. And if you speak, Ava opened her eyes again. They were sharp now, focused. If I speak, they'll have to listen, and not just to me. The car pulled into the loading bay of the Emory, one of Seattle's most luxurious hotels. Paparazzi hadn't arrived yet, but a few camera phones were already pointed in her direction. A woman in business casual did a double take before turning and whispering to a man beside her. Maya Brooks was waiting at the side entrance, holding an umbrella, a laptop bag, and a leather folder. Her curls were pulled back in a sharp bun, and her expression was all business. "We have a window," she said as Ava stepped out. "Media is still circling, but nothing official yet. I booked the event room under private investor meeting. We can control the audience," Legal Ava asked as they entered the side elevator. "They're watching every clip. They'll be ready to respond after your statement. They suggest calm, poised, and not too aggressive." Ava laughed under her breath. It wasn't a joyful sound, because heaven forbid I sound angry about being publicly humiliated. "They mean well," Maya offered gently, "but they don't know what it's like to carry all this while staying soft-spoken." "I'm done staying soft," Ava said, stepping into the executive suite. Inside, a modest podium had been set up. Lights, microphones, a pair of cameras from streaming platforms. Not flashy, not performative, just real. Cameron hovered near the back of the room. His hands were shaking slightly. "You okay?" Ava asked him. "I don't want to lose my job," he admitted, "but I couldn't stay quiet either. My mom raised me better than that." Ava reached out and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, and no matter what happens next, I'll make sure you're protected." He looked like he might cry, but he nodded instead, jaw tightening. Maya handed Ava a copy of her own talking points, but Ava waved it off. She didn't need a script. Her truth was already written in her bones. She stepped to the podium. The cameras turned on, and the room, small as it was, went still. She looked straight into the lens. "My name is Ava Clarke," she began, her voice steady. "I am the founder and CEO of a company valued at over $2.3 billion. I've employed over 4,000 people globally. I've spoken on stages about innovation, equity, and building a better future. But none of that mattered on Flight 708. Her breath caught for just a moment. The memory of the aisle, the security, the silence. It flickered behind her eyes. I was removed from my assigned seat in first class because a white man didn't want me there, because a flight attendant and her supervisor decided he was worth more to them than I was, because in 2025 success still doesn't protect you from being seen as lesser. She paused. The room didn't move. This isn't about comfort. It's not about upgrades. It's about dignity. It's about a system that still believes some people are passengers and others are cargo. She let that settle, then continued. "I'm not here to ask for an apology. I'm here to demand accountability. For every black woman who's ever been told to sit quietly and don't make a fuss. For every person of color who's paid full fare but was treated like a stowaway." Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened. New Heights Air has released a statement calling this a miscommunication. But let's be clear, discrimination is not a glitch. It's a design, and it's time we redesign it. She reached into her folder and pulled out a letter. "This morning, I filed an official complaint with the FAA and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Transportation. I am also beginning proceedings for a class action lawsuit alongside other passengers who've documented similar bias. And I'm launching an independent coalition co-chaired by Reverend Annabelle Lee, to oversee airline equity audits across the top 10 carriers. There were gasps now, not from the cameras, but from staff in the room. The plan wasn't just reaction, it was revolution. Ava placed the letter on the podium. "This is just the beginning," she said, and then she stepped away. The room remained silent for several seconds before one of the live stream platforms pinged with a new viewer count. 3 million and climbing, Reverend Lee whispered. "You've just started something they can't walk away from." Ava didn't smile, but this time she let herself breathe, because she wasn't walking alone anymore. The boardroom of Clarke Innovations, perched atop the 17th floor in downtown Seattle, had never felt as quiet as it did that morning. Even the hum of the espresso machine in the corner seemed to pause. Ava Clarke sat at the head of the table, her presence sharper than ever. Gone was the soft navy blouse from the flight. Today, she wore a fitted black blazer, subtle gold earrings, and her hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her entire body radiated control, even as her mind reeled with calculations, legal, financial, emotional. Maya Brooks sat on her right, laptop open, eyes scanning a fast-scrolling feed of legal correspondence. On Ava's left sat an older gentleman with silver hair and a navy tie, Martin Dorsey, Clarke Innovations General Counsel. Across from them were 3 board members, dialed in via secure video, 2 venture capitalists and 1 government ethics advisor. All of them looked visibly unsettled. "We've had 15 sponsorship deals request meetings," Maya said, scrolling again. 9 are pausing campaigns until we issue a resolution. 4 want statements from the airline directly. "Cowards," muttered Dorsey, mostly to himself. "They're afraid of the blowback," said Elizabeth Ngo, one of the virtual board members. "No one wants to be on the wrong side of this publicly or financially." Ava nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Then it's time we make the sides crystal clear." There was silence for a moment. Dorsey adjusted his glasses. "Your press conference. It was bold. That was the point. But now the FAA is involved. DOT has opened a preliminary review. We're entering murky waters. If the narrative shifts from victim to disruptor." Ava cut in. "If it shifts, it'll be because someone pushed it." She folded her hands on the table. "We didn't start this fire, but we're going to decide what it burns down." Across the room, a soft chime signaled another notification. Maya glanced at the screen, eyes widening slightly. "You need to see this," she said. She tapped a few keys, and a news clip began playing on the large screen behind them. It was a live feed from a morning show. A clean-cut anchor sat beside a woman with sleek blonde hair and a pearl necklace. "We now bring in former flight attendant and training supervisor, Linda Garrett, with New Heights Air," the anchor said. "Linda, you've come forward with claims about internal policies at the airline. Can you tell us what you saw?" Linda looked tired. Her voice was even, but her hands trembled slightly as they rested in her lap. "I worked at New Heights for 8 years, she said. "I trained dozens of flight attendants, and while they don't say it outright, there's a culture, an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "That certain passengers receive priority treatment, regardless of policy, especially if they're on internal watch lists. People flagged as high value or affiliated with major shareholders. I've seen upgrades override paid reservations more times than I can count, and it always seems to come down to appearance." There was a beat of silence on air. Appearance meaning. Linda hesitated. Race, gender, sometimes age. but mostly race. Ava's boardroom was dead silent. I watched the video of Ava Clarke being removed. Linda continued, and I wasn't surprised, because I've seen it happen in quieter ways for years. This time, it was just louder. The screen faded. No one said a word. Dorsey finally spoke. "We have our opening." Ava didn't smile, but something shifted in her posture, an unspoken resolve beginning to sharpen. "Good," she said. "Then here's what we're going to do next." She stood, walking toward the whiteboard behind the table. With a black marker, she wrote a single word in capital letters. "Standard, we launch a program," she said, "one that will partner with civil rights advocates, airline regulators, and private investors. We build an independent task force to audit discriminatory practices in aviation." Maya's eyes lit up. The Clarke Standard Ava nodded. "Systemic Transparency and Reform Directive. It's not just a response, it's a reset." Elizabeth spoke through the screen. "That will put you in direct conflict with major airlines." "I know," Ava said. "That's the point." She turned back to her team. "I don't want their miles. I want their model to change." Dorsey leaned back in his chair. "And what do you want from New Heights?" Ava didn't hesitate. "A public apology, a full admission, and the immediate termination of every crew member involved: Laura Hastings, Frank Reynolds, Captain Holt. I want their corporate culture reviewed by federal regulators. And I want Greg Matheson permanently banned from their elite access list." "That's a tall order," said Elizabeth. "It's justice." Ava replied, "They stripped my dignity in front of 3 million people. I'm giving them the grace of doing the right thing before this becomes 8 million. Maya glanced at her watch. "Speaking of, the Secretary of Transportation has requested a meeting." He saw the press conference. Ava nodded once. "Let's get him on the line." As the call was arranged, Ava stepped out onto the private balcony outside the boardroom. The Seattle wind tousled her blazer, and the early morning sunlight hit her face. For the first time in hours, she let herself pause. Her reflection in the glass door stared back at her, hardened but not broken. She thought again of the little girl she used to be, the one who was always told to speak softly, to not make everything about race, to earn her place and never complain. That girl still lived inside her, but now she stood taller, because that little girl was finally being heard. The door opened behind her. Maya stepped out, holding her phone. "It's time," she said softly. Ava nodded and walked back inside. Laura Hastings had always considered herself a seasoned professional. For over a decade, she had worked across domestic and international routes, navigated emergencies, soothed panicked passengers, and memorized every FAA protocol in the book. She wasn't the warmest flight attendant, she knew that, but she was efficient, focused, respected by her peers. At least, she used to be. Now, her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. She had ignored the first wave of alerts when she disembarked in Tokyo. After all, she told herself, Ava Clarke had caused the problem. The woman could have just accepted the reassignment, enjoyed her drink in Business Plus, and spared everyone the spectacle. That's how Laura had justified it. Anyway. But then came the texts from coworkers, the missed calls from management, the rapid disappearance of her crew chat. Now, slumped alone in her hotel room, with the blinds drawn shut. Laura watched herself on video again and again, her face slightly turned, her lips forming words that had gone viral. "He's on Becker's VIP list. Just swap her out quietly." She didn't remember anyone filming. She didn't remember the man in 2B even looking up. And yet, there she was, caught in a few seconds of carelessness that were now being played across every major platform. News anchors debated it. Commenters dissected it. Strangers messaged her personal account, calling her everything from disgraceful to dangerous. The headline on her screen read, "New Heights Flight Attendant at Center of Racial Discrimination Scandal." Her stomach turned. There was a knock on the door. She sat frozen for a second before forcing herself up. Frank Reynolds stood on the other side, shoulders slumped, a garment bag hanging from his hand. His tie was gone, his shirt half untucked. "You heard he asked?" Laura nodded. "Letting him in? I thought I don't know. Wait. Talk to us first." "They didn't wait," Frank said bitterly, dropping the bag on a chair. "They suspended us both this morning. Captain Holt, too. Indefinite review." Laura blinked. Even Roger Frank nodded. "Corporate's panicking. The whole executive team is in damage control mode. Apparently, Ava Clarke just met with the Secretary of Transportation." Laura sank onto the edge of the bed, head in her hands. "This isn't fair." Frank didn't respond right away. He walked to the minibar, opened a bottle of water, and took a long drink. "She filmed everything," Laura whispered. "They filmed me. They're making me the villain." Frank sat down across from her. "I don't think they need to make us anything. We handed this to them." Laura looked up, eyes sharp. "I followed procedure. We were told to prioritize Becker's list. Matheson's on it. What was I supposed to do? Tell him no. You think if I had refused to move her, Greg would have just smiled and gone quietly." "You didn't just move her," Frank replied. "You assumed she wouldn't fight back. You treated her like she didn't belong." The room fell into heavy silence. Laura stared at the floor, jaw clenched. "I didn't mean to humiliate her," she muttered. "That's the problem," Frank said. "You didn't think about her at all." Outside, the city buzzed, oblivious to the storm unraveling inside the room. Laura stood suddenly, pacing. "She's ruining us." Frank gave a hollow laugh. "She's telling the truth. That's different." Laura turned, eyes red. "You think they're really going to fire all of us? You, me, Roger. Over one seat." Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They already have to answer for decades of whispered bias. We just gave them a name and a face." Laura's phone pinged again. She ignored it. "You think she'll stop at us?" Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to, because across town, in a glass conference room, Ava Clarke was reading through the preliminary findings of her legal team, and the numbers were devastating. 87 discrimination complaints filed against New Heights in the past 5 years. 53 of them from black passengers. 37 mentioning reassignments or downgrades. Only one had been investigated seriously, and that employee was quietly relocated, not disciplined. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Maya passed Ava a new folder. This one just came in. Internal memo leaked from a former regional manager. Confirms they had something called the optics list. Ava raised an eyebrow. What's that Maya read from the memo? Passengers flagged as disruptive risks based on behavioral, political, or demographic markers. That's code for anyone who doesn't look like they belong in first. Ava stared at the line. They had a blacklist, dressed in corporate language. And guess what? Maya added. Greg Matheson sits on the board of 3 companies with heavy stock in the airline. Ava's face didn't change, but something cold settled behind her eyes. Then we don't just take this to the dot, she said. We take it to shareholders. Reverend Lee entered the room then, her cane tapping softly. I just got off the phone with our partners at the Equity Flight Alliance. She said, they're fully on board. They want to co-fund the Clarke Standard across 3 major airline routes. Ava looked at the growing wall of evidence before her. Videos, documents, testimonies. And she realized something. This wasn't about getting justice for herself anymore. This was about creating a world where this never happened again. Not to her, not to anyone. Across the country. Meanwhile, another phone was buzzing, this time in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan. Greg Matheson leaned back in his leather armchair, a tumbler of scotch in hand. His phone screen glowed with news alerts, board meetings, shareholder unrest, client withdrawals. Words like liability and ethics review filled the subject lines. But Greg wasn't worried. Not yet. They'll move on, he muttered to himself. They always do. He scrolled until he found a message from a colleague. They're talking about pulling you from Becker's list. They don't want the attention. Greg's fingers tightened around the glass. Then he tapped out a reply. Let them try. But even as he hit send, something in his chest pulled, because for the first time in a long time, someone he underestimated hadn't gone away quietly. And that silence he'd grown so used to, it was cracking. The Federal Building in downtown Washington. D.C. didn't look like much from the outside. Just another block of stone and glass tucked between older government offices and hotels filled with lobbyists. But inside, the air buzzed with the kind of tension only a high-stakes public hearing could create. Ava Clarke stood in front of a mirror in the private witness lounge, adjusting the cuff of her cream-colored blouse. Her reflection stared back at her calm, alert, but holding something deeper in her eyes. A layer of weariness beneath the strength. Maya stood beside her, flipping through a slim binder. 3 panelists, 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. You'll have 5 minutes for opening remarks before they ask questions. We expect a couple of hostile lines from Senator McDowell, but Chairwoman Gutierrez is in our corner. Ava nodded. What about the public? Maya smiled slightly. Oversubscribed. Standing room only. People are waiting outside, watching it live from their phones. Press outlets are covering the whole thing in real time. A soft knock interrupted them. A young assistant opened the door. They're ready for you. Ms. Clarke. Ava gathered herself and followed Maya down the long corridor. Reverend Lee was already seated inside the hearing room, her cane resting beside her. She gave Ava a quiet nod of encouragement as she passed. The hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled the benches. Every seat was taken. At the long wooden table, Ava took her place beside the microphone and placed her prepared statement down gently. But she didn't read it. She looked up. Chairwoman Maria Gutierrez leaned forward. Ms. Clarke, thank you for appearing today. You may begin. Ava took a breath. 3 weeks ago, I was removed from my assigned seat in first class on a flight I paid for in full. I was not late. I was not disruptive. I was simply black, and in a seat someone else decided I didn't belong in. Murmurs rippled through the room. I was escorted off the plane by security. I was humiliated in front of dozens of passengers. I was silenced by the very industry that markets itself as modern, global, and inclusive. She paused, locking eyes with a few of the lawmakers. But I am not here just to talk about myself. I am here for the 87 passengers who filed complaints and were ignored, for the workers pressured into unethical choices, for the children who will grow up believing that no matter how hard they work, they will still be questioned when they sit in the wrong seat. The room was completely still. I asked this committee not to view this as a PR crisis, but as a systemic failure of equity. I ask you to consider what it means when dignity becomes optional at 30,000 feet. And I ask that we move beyond apologies, beyond settlements, and into accountability. She sat back. Chairwoman Gutierrez nodded solemnly. Thank you. Ms. Clarke. Senator McDowell. Your questions. The senator, a broad-shouldered man with a stern jaw, leaned in. Ms. Clarke. Some have said this issue is being blown out of proportion, that you're using your wealth and platform to create a media firestorm for personal gain. How do you respond to that? Ava didn't blink. My wealth didn't shield me from being profiled. My platform didn't stop them from calling security. If anything, it proves the depth of the issue, because if this can happen to me, imagine how often it happens to those without a voice. McDowell frowned. But you're also launching an initiative, the Clarke Standard. Isn't it possible this entire incident is being used to promote your own interests? Maya shifted in her seat, visibly bristling. Ava leaned forward. I don't need tragedy to build my reputation. I built my company from a garage. I'm here because I have the resources to make change. I'm using my power to hold others accountable. If that makes people uncomfortable, they should ask why justice is only palatable when it's quiet. The room remained quiet for a beat. Chairwoman Gutierrez raised her hand. Let's move to facts. Ms. Clarke, your legal team submitted internal documents from New Heights Air showing a pattern of racial targeting. Can you summarize what you discovered? Ava opened the binder in front of her. We found a coded passenger risk list labeled for internal use only. It prioritized passengers by status, but also flagged them based on what they called optic sensitivity, a term disproportionately applied to people of color. She flipped to the next page. We also found private communications between executives and shareholder liaisons, including Greg Matheson, who directly influenced the seating override that removed me from seat 1A. Gasps from the gallery followed. Maya passed a document to the clerk, who distributed it among the panel. Chairwoman Gutierrez looked grim. Thank you. That will be entered into the official record. Senator Elise Bowman, a younger Democrat from Illinois, spoke next. Ms. Clarke, what do you hope this hearing will accomplish? Ava looked up at her. I hope it reminds the aviation industry that discrimination isn't turbulence, it's a choice. And every time they choose to ignore it, people suffer. Bowman nodded slowly. I want mandatory equity audits. I want independent passenger advocacy boards. And I want public transparency from airlines that receive government subsidies. If we're funding them, we deserve to know who they're excluding. A beat of silence followed. Chairwoman Gutierrez closed her folder. Ms. Clarke, on behalf of this committee, I thank you. Your testimony today has been clear, compelling, and sobering. We'll recess for now and begin deliberations on recommendations for regulatory action. Ava stood. Applause broke out from the public gallery. Real applause. Not just polite clapping, but something more: solidarity, support, respect. She didn't smile, but her chest lifted with a quiet breath of satisfaction. She had walked into that room alone, and walked out knowing she wasn't anymore. Outside the federal building, cameras flashed, questions flew, but Ava just raised one hand in a wave and kept walking. Maya and Reverend Lee followed close behind. On the sidewalk, supporters cheered. A group of flight attendants held signs that read, "Equity takes flight and we stand with Ava." Back in Seattle, Laura Hastings sat watching the hearing on TV, her face pale. For the first time, she saw Ava not as a disruptor, but as a woman who had endured something she herself had helped create. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Should she call? Should she write a letter? Should she testify? Her mind reeled. In another city? Greg Matheson's phone buzzed again. A message from one of his board partners. They're moving to suspend your travel perks. Pressure's rising. Might want to lay low. Greg didn't reply. He just stared at the screen. And for the first time since Flight 708, he began to realize this wasn't going away. Not this time. It was raining in Seattle the day the internal apology letter leaked. Not a public press release. Not a carefully worded social media statement, but an actual internal memo addressed to New Heights staff from the office of CEO Braden Callister. The subject line was Simple Flight 708 Incident. Ava Clarke had just stepped into her home office when Maya rushed in. Tablet in hand, eyes wide. They blinked. She said. Ava looked up from her coffee. Maya tapped the screen and handed it over. The memo was short, but the implications were enormous. To our employees and crew, we recognize the damage done by the events surrounding Flight 708. Our response was delayed and insufficient. We have failed to uphold the standards we claim to represent. We are beginning immediate internal restructuring, launching mandatory racial equity training, and reevaluating all VIP override protocols. We deeply regret the pain caused to Ms. Ava Clarke, and we will be reaching out directly. No signatures, no grand announcements, just the first crack in the wall. Ava set the tablet down carefully. Do you believe them? She asked. Maya sat down, thinking. I believe they've lost control of the narrative. That's what's moving them. Not guilt, just damage. Ava nodded slowly. But the fact that they felt the need to write this at all, that means something. Maya smiled. It means we're not background noise anymore. That afternoon, the sky cleared, and for the first time in weeks, Ava took a walk alone. No press, no bodyguards, no cameras, just herself, a light jacket and a quiet neighborhood. People nodded at her as she passed. A mother with a stroller gave a knowing smile. A teenage girl on her porch gave her a slow clap, then covered her face in embarrassment when Ava turned and waved. At a coffee shop on 9th Street, someone had taped a handwritten sign to the window, reserved for Ava Clarke wherever she sits. She chuckled softly, then continued down the block. Across the city, Frank Reynolds sat in his apartment, holding his official termination letter in both hands. It wasn't a surprise. It had been coming for days. But still, the finality of it hit harder than he expected. He had been in aviation since his 20s, climbed the ladder slowly, worked extra routes, missed birthdays and anniversaries. He hadn't meant to become the face of injustice, but there it was. All because he hadn't stopped Laura. All because he'd stayed silent, chosen convenience over conscience. He picked up the phone and scrolled until he found her name, Laura Hastings. He paused, then tapped. The call rang twice before she answered. I saw the memo, she said without greeting. Me too. A long silence. Frank cleared his throat. I got my termination notice. So did I. He hesitated. Have you talked to anyone? Laura laughed bitterly. You mean besides journalists camped outside my apartment, or former co-workers who won't return my calls? I mean, Ava. Laura went quiet. I wrote her an email. She said finally, didn't send it. I keep rewriting it. What did it say? That I'm sorry, that I wish I had done something different, that I didn't see her as a person, just a task, a problem to move. Frank nodded, even though she couldn't see him. You should send it. She won't care. You don't know that. Laura sighed. What are we supposed to do now? Frank Start, over at 50. Who's going to hire the woman who kicked Ava Clarke out of her seat? He didn't answer, because he didn't know. Back at Ava's house, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she found Reverend Lee standing on the porch, a small box in her hands and a grin on her face. "I brought you something," the Reverend said. Ava stepped aside, letting her in. They sat in the kitchen as the late afternoon light slanted through the windows. Reverend Lee opened the box. Inside was a necklace, delicate gold, with a small charm shaped like a key. "This was my mother's," she said. "She wore it every Sunday." Said it reminded her that every locked door was just waiting for the right hands. Ava looked at her, startled. "You should keep this. I want you to have it." Reverend Lee leaned forward. "You turned a locked door into a front-page headline, into policy, into momentum. That's no small thing. Child." Ava looked down at the necklace, eyes glistening. "You think any of this will really change something I think it already has." Later that night, alone in her office, Ava opened her inbox. Among the messages, hundreds from strangers, from supporters, from students was one labeled, "From Laura Hastings." She paused, clicked, and read, "Miss Clarke, I am writing not because I expect forgiveness, but because you deserve to know that I see now what I didn't see then. You were a person, a woman, someone who earned that seat and more. And I treated you like a problem. I chose the easy path, the corporate path. I failed. I'm sorry. Not for the fallout or the headlines. I'm sorry because I hurt you, and because you didn't deserve it." Ava stared at the message for a long time, then typed a short reply. "Thank you for your honesty. I accept your apology. But real accountability doesn't stop with words. I hope you continue forward differently. That's how healing begins." She hit send and exhaled. It wasn't victory, but it was truth. And sometimes that's even more powerful. 2 weeks had passed since Ava Clarke's hearing in Washington, and yet the aftershocks continued to spread. The aviation industry, long resistant to scrutiny beyond safety and profits, now found itself under a national magnifying glass. 3 major airlines had launched internal audits. The Department of Transportation opened a new Office of Passenger Equity, and across social media, the phrase "who belongs in seat 1A" had become a rallying cry for a new generation of travelers demanding more than window views and tiny bags of pretzels. They wanted dignity. Inside Clarke Innovations, the air was buzzing not with chaos, but with purpose. Maya Brooks scrolled through a list of speaker invitations that had poured in for Ava over the past few days. Top universities, corporate equity summits, even a request from the United Nations Civil Aviation Council. But Ava wasn't thinking about any of that. She was standing beside a long whiteboard in her strategy room, eyes fixed on a diagram she and Maya had been shaping for days. At the top, Clarke's standard beneath it, 6 pillars: transparency, auditability, fair access, crew education, passenger advocacy, and legal oversight. Ava took a step back and crossed her arms. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," she said softly. "This needs to become the norm, not just for me, for every teenager who gets mistaken for staff, for every elder who's ignored, for every woman of color who gets asked if she's in the right seat." Maya looked up. "You think they'll go for it?" "Not all of them," Ava said, "but enough will. And the ones that don't, they'll look real outdated, real fast." The phone rang. Reverend Lee's name appeared on the caller ID. Ava answered. "Hey, Rev. They're ready. We're gate 3. SeaTac, first trial flight under the Clarke standard. Fully trained crew, audited manifest, equity observers on board. Ava's heart skipped. It was happening. She was going back to the skies not as a passenger, not as cargo in a seat reassignment, but as an architect of change. Hours later, Ava stood at the gate with Maya and Reverend Lee, watching boarding begin. The signage was subtle, but present. Small decals by the boarding door that read Standard Certified Crew. Uniforms with equity pins. Even the announcements sounded different, more human, less mechanical. The gate agent, a young man with kind eyes, walked up to Ava. "I know who you are," he said, "and I just want to say thank you. My sister's been a flight attendant for 7 years. She's seen too much. She told me what you did. It gave her hope." Ava smiled. "Then tell her she did the real work. I just gave it a louder microphone." They boarded quietly. No cameras, no fanfare, just the hum of a new standard being born. As the plane ascended over Seattle, Ava looked out the window. Below her, the city shimmered under the fading gold of afternoon light. Her reflection in the glass looked older now, but also clearer, like a woman who had walked through fire and emerged whole, not unscarred, but unbowed. In the seat beside her, Maya flipped open her laptop. "Media response has been solid," she said. "Also, 2 more airlines just signed the standard pledge. Hubeiken, Air, and Horizon." Ava nodded, then paused. "You ever think about how close this all came to not happening?" She asked. "What if I hadn't said anything that day? What if I just got off the plane, like they wanted Maya looked at her? Serious. Then they would have done it to the next Ava, and the next, and no one would have known." Ava exhaled. "I didn't plan for any of this. You know, I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to sit where I paid to sit. I think that's what makes you the right symbol." From behind them, a soft voice interrupted. "Excuse me, Ms. Clarke." They turned to see a young black girl, maybe 12, standing with her father behind her. She wore a hoodie that said STEM Queen and carried a worn copy of Hidden Figures in her hand. "My daughter wanted to say something," the man said, gently nudging her forward. The girl looked shy, but determined. "I saw what happened to you, and what you did after, and I just wanted to say, you made me feel like maybe I can sit in the front row too, not just in planes, in life." Ava blinked, taken off guard by the quiet power in the child's words. She knelt slightly so they were eye level. "What's your name, Bria?" "Well, Bria, let me tell you something. You already belong in every front row there is. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Bria smiled wide. Her father nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you," he said simply, "for all of this." After they returned to their seats, Ava sat back in silence. Tears welled, but didn't fall. This was the reason. Not the hearings, not the headlines, not the press coverage, but Bria and everyone like her. That night, as the plane landed and the passengers applauded softly, Ava felt something release inside her, a quiet closure. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to win against someone. She needed to win for someone. And now, she had. Ava Clarke stood beneath the soft lights of the Global Aviation Ethics Summit in Geneva. A quiet snowfall danced behind the glass windows of the hall. The hush outside a sharp contrast to the hum of voices, the distant clinking of glasses, the echo of decades of silence finally being broken. Tonight was not about celebration. It was about recognition. For the first time in history, a civilian, not a government official, not a former pilot, Not an airline executive had been invited to keynote the most prestigious event in commercial aviation, and not because of status, but because of conviction. The MC stepped up to the mic. When Ms. Clarke was removed from her seat on Flight 708, no one expected the world to change. But it did, and that's because she didn't sit down quietly. She stood up for all of us. Polite applause rose, then crescendoed as Ava walked to the podium. She took her time. There were hundreds in the audience, executives, policymakers, journalists, and somewhere near the front, Bria and her father, flown in as special guests. Ava took a breath and began. When I boarded that flight, all I wanted was to go home. I didn't board as a symbol. I boarded as a tired woman with a boarding pass. Some heads nodded. I had earned that seat, paid for it, but it was taken from me. Not because I was late, not because I was disruptive, but because I didn't look like the person they expected to see in 1A. She paused, and I almost let them take more than the seat. I almost let them take my silence. The room was still, but I remembered who I was, and I remembered all the women who had come before me, the ones who couldn't speak, who didn't have cameras or social media or legal teams. I remembered that I wasn't just fighting for a seat. I was fighting for the right to take up space. Ava looked down at her notes, then folded them and placed them aside. We talk a lot about safety in the skies, about seat belts and turbulence and masks, but we rarely talk about emotional safety, about dignity at altitude, about who gets to belong up here. She gestured lightly toward the ceiling, and the crowd understood. That's what the Clarke Standard was built for, not to punish, but to remind this industry and all industries that access means nothing without respect. The applause was louder this time, sustained. She waited until it faded. Let me be clear. I am not the hero of this story. I'm just the woman who said no. The heroes are the ones who stood up after me, the crew members who risked jobs to testify, the lawmakers who held the line, the parents who showed their kids my photo and said, "That's what courage looks like." Her eyes found Bria in the audience. The girl beamed back at her. Ava's voice softened. I used to think legacy was something you built when you were old. But I've learned that legacy is just the echo of our choices. And sometimes, the smallest echo, one word, one refusal, one story can break open the sky. A standing ovation rose around her, but Ava didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled for herself. Later that evening, she found a quiet corner of the event space and stood by the tall window, watching snow fall against the dark glass. Maya joined her, 2 flutes of sparkling water in hand. "You crushed it," she said, passing one to Ava. Ava chuckled. "I think I blacked out halfway through." "Well, you blacked out into history." They toasted gently, and for a moment, said nothing. Then Maya turned serious. "There's something I think you should see." She pulled out her phone and handed it to Ava. It was a video, grainy, clearly recorded on an old phone. A woman stood in a small community center, reading from a note card. The caption read, "Laura Hastings speaks publicly for the first time." Ava watched in silence. I used to think professionalism meant obedience. That following protocol meant you were doing your job. But sometimes, protocol is prejudice dressed in a blazer. And if you follow it blindly, you're not doing your job. You're doing damage. Laura looked older, humbled. I lost my career, but I found my conscience. And that's worth something. It has to be. Ava handed the phone back, quietly moved. "She's trying," Maya said. That's all anyone can do. I hope she keeps going." Ava replied, "That's how the real work starts." Back in the States, another kind of work was beginning. Frank Reynolds had taken a position at a nonprofit focused on retraining airline staff in ethics and trauma-informed care. He had no salary yet, but he said the work felt like flying again. Greg Matheson had been removed from every corporate travel board and was under federal investigation for undisclosed lobbying efforts. His name no longer triggered admiration in the executive lounges. Now, it brought side eyes and quiet exits. And across airports nationwide, something unexpected had started to appear. People were talking to each other. Crew members pausing to ask how passengers were doing. Gate agents watching for more than ticket barcodes. A kind of unspoken awareness that perhaps the person you underestimated today might be tomorrow's Ava Clarke. A month later, Ava returned to SeaTac. No cameras, no handlers, just a carry-on and a flight to Houston. At the gate, a child was struggling to zip her pink backpack. Her mother was juggling a baby. Ava stepped forward, knelt, and helped the girl close the zipper. The child smiled shyly and said thank you. As they walked off, the mother turned back. "You're her, aren't you?" Ava nodded, surprised. "I just want you to know, they made my mom get off a plane once, years ago. I never understood why, but now I know, and now she knows she wasn't alone." Ava watched them go, her heart full. She boarded the plane, seat 1A. No one questioned her. No one whispered. The crew smiled warmly, as they did to every passenger. As the plane climbed through cloud, Ava looked out the window, watching sunlight break through, and for the first time in her life, flying felt like freedom, not because of the altitude, but because of the truth that had taken flight with her. In a world where silence is often rewarded and injustice swept beneath corporate gloss, Ava Clarke chose to speak. She didn't shout. She didn't retaliate with fury. She simply stood in her truth and let the truth speak louder than power. Because this wasn't just about one seat in first class. It was about every quiet indignity, every whispered doubt, every time someone is made to feel they don't belong because of the color of their skin, and in choosing to fight not just for herself, but for every Briah watching from the sidelines. Ava gave us more than a headline. She gave us a mirror. We leave this story not just with admiration, but with questions. What kind of world do we want at 30,000 feet? Who gets to feel safe, seen, and worthy without exception? And what will we do the next time we witness injustice in real time? Because discrimination doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in policies, in silence, in ignored apologies, and justice. Justice whispers back until someone like Ava makes it roar. If this story moved you, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that uncover hidden truths and lift up unheard voices. We'll see you in the next one. Because stories like this, they're just getting started.